So today is kind of a sad story. So what we're going to talk about today is a comic book writer that is famous but not famous. And what I mean by that is he's the writer for this. G.I. Joe, a real American hero. A lot of you seen the cartoons. A lot of you've seen the legacy growing up, how the G.I. Joe and Transformers always cross over, and they've had numerous G.I. Joe shows over the years, everything from G.I. Joe to Sergeant Savage to Sigma 6, G.I. Joe Extreme, G.I. Joe Renegade, all of it. So it's a thing. It's a thing. It's literally one of the most famous 80s franchises that's still kind of sort of going on. The toy market for them is still very strong with a lot of the older collectors. A lot of new kids don't really know anything about it, but it's okay. It's okay. It's like these franchises slowly die out. So who we're going to talk about specifically in this, because normally I would give you a discussion about Sergeant Slaughter and his entire hysterical way how he became the mascot, but that'll be a different video. What we're going to talk about today is going to be Larry Hama. Larry Hama is the writer for G.I. Joe, and he's the one that made everything you can think about. He's the one that made Hawk the leader. He's the one that made Duke, Duke the backup. He's the one that had that relationship between Snake Eyes and Scarlet. And the reason why we're talking about him is if you look him up, his Facebook page is his real page. That's literally where he talks about everything. And he's a very, very bitter dude. Very bitter. And for really good reasons. See, Larry Hama's in his late 60s, early 70s. And he still writes G.I. Joe. He's been writing G.I. Joe since issue 1. And he is on 300 and something. He's been writing G.I. Joe through Marvel. He did it through DW Comics, which is, I think, technically Image. He did it with IDW, and he's also doing it with Image and Skybound. And the reason why Larry is bitter is he made all this lore. He made everything with G.I. Joe personally, because no one else wanted the job, and he got stuck with it at Marvel. And Hasbro didn't pay him much for any of this. He literally talks about how he can't retire because he doesn't have enough money, because they never paid him royalties, they never gave him any credit. He's not even on the cartoon as a credit for creating all the lore that the cartoon's about. He's not even on that. He's literally Hasbro's stepchild, is the best way I can explain it. And it's really interesting because how we got here is that obviously when you work in the comic industry, you have to sign a work-for-hire contract. And the work-for-hire contracts nowadays are a lot better than they used to be, because they used to be bad. Really bad. Especially during 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. To the point to where anything you drew on or off the clock belonged to the company. You were pretty much the company, no matter what you did. And this screwed a lot of people out of copyrights. It took Venom from Todd McFarlane. It took Deadpool away. It took about a lot of things. Steve Ditko got screwed out of Spider-Man by Stan Lee. You have Jack Kirby was screwed out of all kinds of stuff. X-Men, Fantastic Four, all of these properties. All because of the way these contracts were worded. And a lot of people in the industry, like Stan Lee especially, was very, very sneaky with how he would trick these people into contracts. He wouldn't explain it. He would just be like, hey, sign here. This is your renewal contract. All that. He wouldn't even bother telling people about the details, which I get it. It's a contract. It's your right to read it and all that. But if 99% of all the people that signed it are getting screwed over, that's a sign. And things changed in the 80s and 90s because there was a massive lawsuit between a lot of the famous people, like Bob Kane versus DC, Steve Ditko versus Marvel. You had Jack Kirby versus Marvel. And that's why things are better today, because this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they pretty much ruled that, yeah, you're doing deceptive practices and all this kind of stuff. Like, if you read the court case, it's phenomenal. And Larry Hama came on board for Marvel during the 80s. Well, G.I. Joe during the 80s. And he ended up making this fantastic story. And he did everything. Like, he pretty much made the rivalry between Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow, the love between Snake Eyes and Scarlet. Like, he did all the character personas. Like, he did all this crazy stuff. Like, he actually was in the military. He was actually drafted during a war, and he used all his combat experience to make this comic as realistic as possible. And he did a phenomenal job. Like, if you read this, you really feel like they're in the military. Like, the stuff they talk about, it's like, it'll go over your head if you have no idea anything about military, but it's a great comic. And what's really sad about it is the comic is, like, underproduced. It's pretty rare. Like, people read it during the 80s, so you can buy, like, individual comics. But they don't have too many, like, the bound collections are pretty expensive if you're looking for the IDW ones. I know Skybound put out the issue 1 through 50 mega omnibus, but who knows if we'll get the rest. Like, they never announced it or talked about it. So every time these things are re-released, Larry Hama doesn't get a cent. Like, he even talks about how he doesn't make any money off of these things. And he's a very bitter dude, because he's upset he has to work through his retirement. And it's really sad seeing him go through this experience with everything he's done for Hasbro and for these other companies, and he's gotten little to no recognition. Like, yeah, he shows up as the writer. He gets invited to conventions, but that's pretty much it. Like, Hasbro doesn't really bend over backwards to have him at PR events. They don't really have him, like, consult on anything, even though he made everything. Like, they literally consider him just an everyday employee. Like, imagine if Shakespeare wrote all his plays, and then someone else took credit, and then every time they reinterpreted his works, they wouldn't even bother talking to him. That's literally what happened here. And it's really dark, and it's really dirty, and it's a phenomenal situation of how comic book artists were treated and how they still are treated to an extent. And it really brings up the morality of how these companies are able to abuse these people to this extent and get away with it just for the sake of corporate profit.